Hello, my name is Sarah Curran, and today I will be exploring elements of the Gerlach and Eli instructional design model. This model of instruction was created by Vernon S. Gerlach and Donald P. Eli in 1971, and although it is not credited as being the first model of instruction, it has stood the test of time as being a model that is still effective in today's classroom setting. It is important to note that this model of instruction can be applied at the K-12 level and is also applicable for higher education purposes as well, which makes it an incredibly versatile and highly used model. As a matter of fact, after nearly 50 years, it is still widely used and still considered effective. It is important to note that this instructional design model was created specifically with teachers and educators in mind. Let's take a closer look at the inner workings of the Gerlach and Eli model of instruction. Their approach stemmed from the need to have a model that classroom teachers could use easily, even if they were short on time and resources, and any teacher can emphasize with that acknowledgement. Up until that point, previous models didn't always take these factors into account, and as educators, we realize how important these factors actually are. Basically, Gerlach and Eli wanted to offer a model that could be effective yet user friendly at the same time. Additionally, according to Sarah Grabowski, this model takes on a systematic approach to teaching and learning and was developed with the idea that the average teacher is inherently an instructional designer. According to Sir Hotkert, the central focus of the Gerlach and Eli model is on linear systematic planning, which basically means that there is a step-by-step process to be followed in order to comply with the model with equal emphasis on two essential factors of effective teaching: clearly defined teaching goals and methods for reaching each of the desired learning outcomes. In other words, this model aims to ensure that there is one, goals that are thoughtfully defined, and two, a clear path is established in which these goals will be attained. These two elements are critical to the success of the Gerlach and Eli model. Now, let's further explore how it is that these two factors are successfully implemented. There are 10 elements that address one, the other, or sometimes both of these factors. Here you can see the flow of the Gerlach and Eli instructional model. Let's take a quick overarching look at the basic directives included in this model before we break it apart to look at it more closely. Steps 1 and 2 require a basic look at the content that is to be covered and what the exact objectives will be. Step 3 requires the teacher determine the needs of her students and the prior knowledge they may have on the given topic. Steps 4 through 8 they take a closer look at the inner workings of the lesson, including determining lesson strategy, grouping students, time allotment, space requirement, and resource selection. And step 9 encourages the teachers to offer an authentic assessment to determine student learning. And finally, step 10 allows the teacher to examine and reflect on the assessments to determine the efficacy of her lesson. You'll also notice that although most of this process is linear, there's also this cyclical pattern towards the end as well. This is allowing for the teacher to reteach if the final analysis of feedback yields less than adequate results. Or in following years or following lessons, she can go back to 1 and 2 to alter her teaching to make it even more effective. Let's first take a look at steps 1 and 2. You'll notice that steps 1 and 2 appear to be occurring simultaneously, even though they are ordinal. This is to acknowledge that although specification of content usually occurs before the specification of objectives, it is not necessary that one be completed before the other in order to be successful. These steps are simply a starting point for the teacher. It is here that she will determine what her lesson will be about and what objectives she will focus on. Now let's look at step 3. It is here that a teacher is activating her students' prior knowledge about the content that was decided upon in steps 1 and 2. This can be a formal step in the form of a pretest, or it can be less formal and based upon teacher observation or a simple understanding of a progression of learning based on past teaching in the content area of choice. Gerlach and Eli emphasize the importance of examining this prior knowledge to ensure that one's teaching is effective. Now let's take a look at the chunk of the Gerlach and Eli model known as the group of simultaneous decisions. These are steps 4 through 8. Although they are fairly self-explanatory, it is important to explore each step for those that are not familiar with the education setting. Step 4 is the determination of strategy. What method will the teacher use to teach her objectives? This can be a traditional lecture style, inquiry based, self paced online lessons, or combination of all of these, or something completely different. Step 5 is the determination of group organization. Will the students be learning as a whole group, small group, partners, combination of all these? An understanding of student population is essential here to determine what makeup would yield the best results for the objectives. Step 6 is allocation of time, a basic idea of how many days, hours, or lessons will be required to teach the objectives. Step 7 is simply determining what space is required for the lesson, and step 8 implores the teacher to determine any and all resources that would be most effective in helping her achieve her goals presented in steps 1 and 2. Gustafson and Branch suggest that this step encourages the teacher to locate, obtain, and adapt or supplement existing instructional materials. End quote. There is a focus on simply selecting the materials to use, that rather than creating instructional materials from scratch. Gerlach and Eli emphasize previewing and planning this material, however, to minimize the need for revision in the later evaluation stage. According to the International Society for Educational Technology, steps 4 through 8 are what's known as interdependent. That means that a decision concerning one of these steps in this chunk could very well affect a decision for another step in this chunk. Let's take a look at an example. Determining the organization of groups may actually affect your allocation of space. Let's say you have a small group activity that requires a space that allows for pods of children to successfully communicate. Additionally, the determination of strategy may very well affect your selection of resources. If a teaching strategy requires the use of technology, then obvious resource choices would be Chromebooks, short throws, or any other number of technological devices. These are all the steps that a teacher must take into consideration as the inner workings of her lesson, the core of her instruction. Much of what is determined here is a direct result of step number 3 in examining what works best for a teacher's specific class and her objectives. Step 9. Moving to step 9, it is here that an evaluation of one's teaching occurs by measuring student progress and understanding of the objectives. A teacher must decide what method she will use to measure the efficiency of her lesson, of her teaching, based on her students' achievement and mastery of the content at hand. There are many ways to achieve this step, both formally and informally. Group, individual presentations, written assessments, culminating projects, which incorporate technology, the list goes on and on. But the most important thing to remember here is that the assessment is authentic and truly aims to determine student understanding. Step 10. This is where the teacher can reflect on the previous steps and examine the assessment results from step 9, where she evaluated her objectives, to determine if her lesson achieved appropriate student understanding. One can notice here that the model takes this cyclical turn that we referred to earlier. This is to allow for the teacher to actually take her findings from this step and use it to alter her teaching in the future to achieve even greater results than before. This is a very important step to ensure that teachers do not just simply move on from a lesson, but truly use the assessments as a guided self-reflection. After examining each of the 10 steps, it is easy to see how this instructional design model can easily be applied to a classroom setting. And, most likely, an educator can already identify with these steps as part of a process that she already works through when crafting a lesson for her classroom. Let's take a look at a real-life classroom application using the Gerlach and Eli instructional design model. For explanation's sake, we will take a look at a very simple objective that would be applicable in an early elementary setting. Steps 1 and 2, specification of content and objectives. Again, these are considered interchangeable, and it is not necessary to consider one before the other to be successful. In this scenario, the specification of content is life science with a focus on the life cycle of the butterfly, and the specification of objectives is that, upon the completion of this instructional model, individual students will be able to correctly order and label the 4 stages of a butterfly's life cycle using a web-based tool. At this point, the educator would assess the entering behaviors of her students at step 3. This activation of prior knowledge can be accomplished through various means: simple verbal analysis, KWL charts, referencing a scope and sequence chart for a particular grade level, a graffiti wall, or however the teacher feels she will gather the most information. Let's just say that after completing a method of activating prior knowledge with her class, an educator has discovered that her students are aware that butterflies are living creatures and they are aware that living things grow and change. Steps 4 through 8, again, are where the meat of the lesson occurs. Step 4, the determination of strategy, where the teacher decides what her actual lesson components are. In this example, the educator has decided that she will use the science curriculum big book and the Very Hungry Caterpillar for introduction. She will also use the short throat to show World Book Kids online video to demonstrate the butterfly life cycle. There's a corresponding sheet, an egg to butterfly song. A teacher will have the students create the life cycle of a butterfly using noodles and plates. That looks something like this, using a variety of different kinds of noodles to represent the different stages of the butterfly's life. And also, they will observe the actual life cycle of butterflies after ordering caterpillars from a company. Okay, moving on to step 5. Whoops, let's get back there. And step 5 is where you determine organization of groups. Different pieces of the lesson call for different organization of groups. In this case, whole group setting is the big book, the song, and the movie. Pairs is the noodle craft, and individual complete the worksheets and create the life cycle of a butterfly using given words and pictures using an online tool, which would look something like this as an assessment tool. It would take us to our Brain Pop Junior site, which some districts have subscriptions to. And the students would use both images to drag and drop, as well as words. And create the entire life cycle. Move the arrows however they see fit and create the entire life cycle. Okay, and step 6 will be how the educator determines pacing, length of lesson, and how many days are required to decide upon here. For this particular lesson, it will be separated into 4 40-minute science lessons. Day 1 is the big book movie worksheet. Day 2, review, song, and noodle craft. Day 3, create the online life cycle. Day 4, finish and pair share the end product after they have printed it out. And also, during that time, there will be consistent butterfly observation of the life cycle over a 2-week period. And step 7 calls for the allocation of space. For this lesson, the bulk of it will occur in the actual classroom with a brief visit outside to release the butterflies. And step 8 encourages the teacher to gather her resources. Here, I won't go over them, but I have listed the various materials that are required to complete this lesson. Okay, on to step 9, which is the step of the process where there's an actual evaluation of performance. This usually takes the form of an authentic assessment to determine understanding of the students. In this case, it is the online drawing tool on BrainPop that will be used. The teacher will evaluate the final project to decide if her lesson will be successful. She will evaluate for correct order placement of the pictures and correct words next to each phase of the butterfly's life cycle. Step 10, analysis of feedback. The teacher can reflect on the results of the assessment and alter her teachings in the future based upon whether or not the students could successfully complete the final assignment. In this case, do students correctly order the phases of the life cycle? Have students place the correct label by each phase? Do students show mastery of the content? And this will be done by simply looking at a printout of their brain pop activity, and that would be your final analysis. Of course, with anything, there are advantages and disadvantages, and this also applies to the Gerlach and Eli model of instruction. As far as advantages, this model is very easy to understand and implement. A novice teacher would be able to apply this to her classroom on day 1, yet it's still a very effective model for even a very seasoned teacher. Additionally, this method allows for a variety of teaching and learning styles. Although it is very scripted, it allows for the teacher to be the full ultimate designer of her instruction based on the needs of her particular students and her own individual teaching style. Also, the Gerlach and Eli model is very objective driven and prescribes a specific model for achieving these goals. With the general standards push in today's education setting, a model that focuses heavily on objectives surely is an advantage. And with advantages, we always have disadvantages. One disadvantage of this method is that there is not a set location to allow for lesson modifications. There are always IEP and 504s to consider in a classroom when creating a lesson plan. A teacher can always add these modifications herself, but a designated spot would certainly be helpful. Also, where many teachers thrive on a linear, solid model to incorporate their lessons into, some teachers may find this is restricting, or an incredibly seasoned teacher may feel that it is too detail oriented. Lastly, with the consideration that this particular model was created specifically with the classroom in mind, it is not easily translatable to other scenarios. For instance, in the business world, it might not be an effective training technique. The Gerlach and Eli model is an instructional design model that has stood the test of time. Its ease of use, simple implementation capabilities, thorough explanations, and allowance for reflection make it easy to see why this model is one that many educators would consider an effective instructional model. Thank you for your time.